Chief Justice John Roberts faces off with Representative Jasmine Crockett in a fiery congressional hearing, her sharp questions exposing Supreme Court ethics flaws, sparking a tense battle that could redefine judicial trust. The hearing room buzzed with anticipation, a charged atmosphere that felt more like a courtroom than a congressional chamber. Rows of polished wooden benches were packed with aides, reporters, and spectators, their whispers creating a low hum that underscored the gravity of the moment. At the center of it all sat Chief Justice John Roberts, his expression composed but his eyes betraying a flicker of unease. Opposite him, Representative Jasmine Crockett, a rising star from Texas known for her incisive intellect and unyielding resolve, adjusted her notes with a calm that belied the storm she was about to unleash. The topic: the Supreme Court's ethical standards, or, as Crockett would soon argue, the lack thereof. This was no routine inquiry. It was a reckoning. Crockett leaned forward, her voice steady but laced with an edge that commanded attention. "Chief Justice Roberts," she began, "the American people deserve a judiciary they can trust. Yet we've seen reports of justices accepting lavish gifts, undisclosed trips, and cozy relationships with political donors. How does this square with the court's commitment to impartiality?" The room fell silent, every eye on Roberts. His jaw tightened imperceptibly, but he maintained his trademark composure, offering a measured response about the court's internal guidelines and the independence of justices. It was a practiced answer, one he'd given before, but Crockett wasn't here for platitudes. She pressed harder, her questions like arrows finding their mark. "With all due respect, sir, guidelines are not laws. When justices fail to disclose ties to donors who have business before the court, it erodes public faith. Can you explain why the Supreme Court resists mandatory ethics reforms?" Roberts shifted in his seat, his fingers tapping lightly on the table. He spoke of judicial independence again, but his words felt hollow against Crockett's relentless precision. She cited specific instances: trips funded by billionaire donors, unreported real estate deals, each example meticulously researched, each one landing like a blow. The spectators exchanged glances. This was no ordinary questioning. Crockett was dismantling the court's carefully curated image, piece by piece. The tension escalated as Crockett's tone remained unflinchingly polite, yet razor-sharp. "Chief Justice, the public sees a double standard. Everyday Americans face consequences for far less, yet the highest court in the land operates with no enforceable code. How do you justify that to a nation demanding accountability?" Roberts' face betrayed a hint of frustration, his usual calm tested by Crockett's refusal to relent. He countered with a defense of the court's traditions, but his words were drowned out by the weight of her argument. The room felt smaller, the air thicker, as if the walls themselves were closing in on the Chief Justice. Crockett's eyes locked onto Roberts, her presence commanding the space. She wasn't just a congresswoman. She was a legal scholar, a former public defender who'd spent years navigating the trenches of the justice system. Her questions weren't rooted in grandstanding but in a deep understanding of the law and its impact on real people. She spoke of families who'd lost faith in the system, of communities betrayed by rulings that seemed to favor the powerful. Her words resonated, stirring murmurs of agreement from the audience. Roberts, for the first time, seemed on the defensive, his polished demeanor cracking under the weight of her scrutiny. As the session neared its close, Crockett delivered a final piercing question. "Chief Justice, if the Supreme Court won't hold itself accountable, who will?" The silence that followed was deafening, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Roberts opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the gavel struck, signaling a recess. The room erupted in whispers, reporters scrambling to capture the moment. Crockett gathered her notes, her expression unreadable, while Roberts stared. Ahead, his composure rattled. The battle had just begun, and everyone knew it. The hearing room pulsed with restless energy as the recess ended. the crowd settling back into their seats with a mix of anticipation and unease. Representative Jasmine Crockett's unanswered question still echoed, a challenge that had left Chief Justice John Roberts visibly unsettled. His usually unflappable demeanor was fraying, and the spectators could sense it. Crockett, meanwhile, sat poised, her gaze fixed on the table before her, as if mentally preparing for the next round. The gavel struck again, and the confrontation resumed, the air crackling with the promise of escalation. Roberts, perhaps sensing the need to reclaim control, spoke first, his voice firm but tinged with an edge of defensiveness. Representative Crockett, the Supreme Court operates under a system of checks and balances, as does Congress. Our independence ensures we uphold the Constitution, not public opinion. It was a calculated move, an attempt to shift the narrative, but Crockett was ready. She tilted her head slightly, a faint smile playing on her lips, not of amusement, but of resolve. "With respect, Chief Justice," she said, her tone cutting through his words like a blade, "independence doesn't mean immunity. When justices engage in undisclosed dealings, it's not just optics, it's a breach of the public's trust." The room leaned in, captivated by her precision. Crockett didn't raise her voice, but every syllable carried weight. She pulled out a stack of documents, her fingers flipping through pages with deliberate care. "Let's talk specifics," she said, her eyes meeting Roberts. "A justice attended a private retreat hosted by a donor with cases before the court. No disclosure. Another accepted a loan forgiveness deal, undisclosed. These aren't hypotheticals, they're facts. How does the court justify this secrecy?" The murmurs from the audience grew louder, a ripple of shock spreading through the room. Roberts' face tightened, his fingers interlocking as he leaned forward, clearly unprepared for the granular detail of her attack. He attempted a response, emphasizing the court's voluntary ethics guidelines, but Crockett cut in, her voice steady but unrelenting. "Voluntary isn't enough, sir. The public doesn't trust voluntary when it comes to the most powerful court in the land. We're not talking about a book club, we're talking about justice." The jab landed, and a few spectators stifled gasps. Roberts' eyes narrowed, a flash of irritation breaking through his composure. He countered, his tone sharper now, accusing Crockett of politicizing the judiciary. "The court's work is not a spectacle for congressional theater," he said, his words clipped. It was a misstep, and Crockett seized it. "Theater?" she repeated, her voice low but searing. "This isn't theater, Chief Justice. This is accountability. The American people deserve to know why their highest court operates in shadows." She leaned forward, her presence commanding the room. "You speak of independence, but what about transparency? Why does the court resist a binding ethics code when every other branch of government is held to one?" The question hung in the air, unanswerable yet demanding a response. Roberts hesitated, his silence amplifying the tension. The spectators held their breath, sensing the shift in power. Crockett pressed on, her arguments weaving together legal expertise and moral clarity. She spoke of the Constitution, not as an abstract ideal, but as a living promise to the people. "The court's legitimacy rests on trust," she said, "and trust is earned, not assumed. When justices hide their ties to power, they undermine the very system they swear to protect." Her words resonated, stirring nods from the audience and even a few lawmakers. Roberts, now visibly strained, attempted to pivot, citing the complexity of judicial ethics, but Crockett was relentless. She countered with examples of lower courts adopting stricter codes, exposing the Supreme Court's resistance as an outlier. As the session drew to a close, the room felt electric, the clash between Crockett's unyielding logic and Roberts' embattled defense reaching a fever pitch. She delivered a final, piercing statement. "Chief Justice, if the court won't lead on ethics, Congress will. The question is, will you fight us or join us?" The words landed like a gauntlet thrown, and before Roberts could respond, the gavel struck, halting the exchange. The room buzzed with fervor, reporters already typing furiously. Crockett's calm gaze met Roberts' strained one, and in that moment, everyone knew the battle was far from over. The hearing room crackled with unresolved tension as the gavel's echo faded. Representative Jasmine Crockett's challenge to Chief Justice John Roberts lingering like a storm cloud. Her words, "Will you fight us or join us?" had shifted. The dynamic, casting Roberts as a man, cornered not just by a congresswoman, but by the weight of public expectation. The brief recess did little to cool the atmosphere. If anything, it amplified the stakes. Reporters whispered in huddles, their laptops glowing with half-written headlines, while spectators craned their necks, eager for the next salvo. Crockett sat composed, her notes neatly stacked, but her eyes burned with purpose. Roberts, across from her, adjusted his glasses, his face a mask of restraint, though the tightness in his jaw betrayed the pressure mounting within. As the session resumed, Roberts took the offensive, his voice measured but laced with a new intensity. "Representative Crockett, your zeal for reform is noted, but the Supreme Court's independence is not a flaw to be fixed. It's a cornerstone of our democracy." He leaned forward, his gaze steady, aiming to reassert authority. "Congressional overreach risks undermining the very balance you claim to protect." It was a bold move, framing Crockett's push as a threat to the Constitution itself, but she was unfazed. Her lips curved into a faint, knowing smile, and she responded with a calm that belied the fire in her words. "Chief Justice, the balance you speak of is broken when justices act with impunity. Independence doesn't excuse secrecy. It demands accountability." The exchange escalated, each word a spark in a growing blaze. Crockett reached for her documents, pulling out a new set of records with deliberate precision. "Let's discuss influence," she said, her voice cutting through the room's hum. A justice's spouse was paid millions by a firm with cases before the court. No recusal, no disclosure. How does that align with the impartiality you defend? The audience gasped, the specificity of her evidence landing like a thunderclap. Roberts' eyes flickered with surprise, his fingers pausing mid-tap on the table. He began to respond, citing the personal autonomy of justices' families, but Crockett interjected, her tone sharp yet controlled. "Personal autonomy stops mattering when it influences rulings that affect millions. The public deserves to know where the lines are drawn." Roberts' composure wavered, his voice rising slightly as he accused Crockett of sensationalizing complex issues. "These matters are not as simple as you present, Representative. The court's deliberations are private for a reason." It was a miscalculation, and Crockett pounced. "Private, not secret," she countered, her words slicing through his defense. "The court's deliberations should be sacred, but its conflicts of interest? Those belong in the light." The room erupted in murmurs, lawmakers exchanging glances, some nodding in agreement. Crockett's ability to distill complex legal issues into stark moral truths was shifting the narrative, and Roberts could feel the ground slipping beneath him. She pressed on, her arguments weaving a tapestry of logic and passion. "The Supreme Court isn't above the law. It's entrusted to uphold it. Yet when justices dodge transparency, they send a message. Power protects power." She paused, letting the words sink in, her gaze sweeping the room before locking back on Roberts. "You've said the court polices itself, but where's the proof? Where are the consequences for ethical lapses?" The question hung heavy, unanswered, as Roberts shifted uncomfortably. He attempted to pivot, emphasizing the court's historical integrity, but Crockett's evidence, dates, names, transactions, was too precise, too damning. The tension reached a boiling point as Crockett leaned forward, her voice steady but electric. "Chief Justice, the American people aren't asking for perfection. They're asking for honesty. Why does the court fear it?" Roberts opened his mouth, but no words came, his silence amplifying her point. The gavel struck, cutting off the moment. But the room buzzed with energy, spectators whispering furiously. Crockett gathered her papers, her expression resolute, while Roberts stared ahead, his face a storm of frustration and defiance. The confrontation was spiraling, and the next round promised to be explosive. The hearing room thrummed with raw anticipation, the weight of Representative Jasmine Crockett's unanswered question, "Why does the court fear honesty?" still reverberating. The gavel strike had paused the clash, but it couldn't quell the electric undercurrent pulsing through the chamber. Spectators shifted in their seats, their whispers a fevered hum, while reporters typed with frenetic urgency, capturing every nuance of the escalating duel. Chief Justice John Roberts sat rigid, his hands clasped tightly, his eyes betraying a storm of calculation and defiance. Across from him, Crockett adjusted her glasses, her calm exterior masking the relentless resolve that had already shaken the room. The recess ended, and as the gavel signaled the session's resumption, all eyes locked on the two combatants, poised for a confrontation that felt seismic. Roberts, sensing the need to regain footing, spoke first, his voice deliberate but edged. With barely concealed irritation, "Representative Crockett, your accusations risk painting the entire court as untrustworthy, which is neither fair nor accurate. The judiciary's role is to interpret the law, not to bend to public pressure." It was a strategic pivot, an attempt to cast Crockett's probing as reckless, but she was undeterred. Her eyes narrowed slightly, a spark of defiance flashing as she responded. "Chief Justice, this isn't about bending to pressure. It's about answering to the people. When the court hides its conflicts, it's not protecting the law. It's protecting itself." The words cut deep, and the audience leaned forward, hanging on her every syllable. Crockett reached for a new set of documents, her movements precise, almost theatrical in their restraint. "Let's talk about access," she said, her voice steady but piercing. "A justice sat on a case involving a corporation that funded their child's education. No disclosure, no recusal. How does that serve justice?" The room gasped, the specificity of her evidence sending a jolt through the crowd. Robert's face flushed, his fingers twitching as he gripped the edge of the table. He countered, his tone sharp, accusing Crockett of cherry-picking isolated incidents to smear the court. "These are personal matters, Representative, not systemic." "Failures," he said. But his words lacked conviction, drowned out by the weight of her facts. Crockett didn't flinch. "Personal matters become public problems when they influence the bench," she shot back, her voice rising just enough to underscore her point. "The court's rulings shape lives. Health care, voting rights, workers' protections. When justices are entangled with donors, the public doesn't see justice, they see favoritism." The room erupted in murmurs, a few spectators nodding vigorously. Robert's eyes darted to the audience, his composure fraying as Crockett's words struck a chord. He attempted to redirect, invoking the court's deliberative process, but she cut through his defense with surgical precision. "Deliberations are sacred, sir, but conflicts of interest are not. Why does the court shield them?" The confrontation intensified, each exchange of verbal thrust and parry. Crockett's arguments blended legal rigor with a moral urgency that captivated the room. She spoke of the Constitution as a pact with the people, not a shield for the powerful. "The court's power comes from trust," she said, her gaze locked on Roberts. "When you refuse transparency, you break that trust. Why is that a price you're willing to pay?" Roberts' silence was deafening, his earlier defensiveness giving way to a strained reticence. He managed a response, citing the court's traditions, but it felt rote, outmatched by Crockett's relentless clarity. As the session neared its end, the tension was palpable, the air thick with the stakes of their clash. Crockett leaned forward, her voice a blend of steel and conviction. "Chief Justice, the American people are watching. They want a court that serves justice, not power. Will you give them that, or will you hide behind excuses?" The question landed like a challenge, unanswerable yet impossible to ignore. Roberts stared back, his face a mask of conflict, as the gavel struck, halting the exchange. The room buzzed with fervor, reporters scrambling to capture the moment. Crockett's gaze held steady, while Roberts looked away, the weight of her words pressing down. The final round loomed, and the outcome hung in the balance. The hearing room vibrated with the aftershock of Representative Jasmine Crockett's challenge. Her words, "Will you give them that, or will you hide behind excuses?" still searing the air. The gavel's strike had only paused the storm, not dispelled it. Spectators sat on edge, their whispers a restless tide, while reporters' fingers flew across keyboards, racing to immortalize the moment. Chief Justice John Roberts, his face a taut mask of conflict, stared at the table, his hands clenched, as if grappling with the weight of her words. Crockett, unyielding, sat with a quiet intensity, her eyes fixed on him, radiating a resolve that had transformed the hearing into a crucible. As the final session began, the gavel's sharp rap signaled the last act of a confrontation that had gripped the nation. Roberts, his voice strained but resolute, opened with a bid to reclaim authority. "Representative Crockett, your passion is evident, but the court's integrity is not served by public trials. We uphold the law through deliberation, not spectacle." It was a final stand, a defense of tradition, but Crockett was ready. Her gaze sharpened, and she leaned forward, her voice steady yet charged with conviction. "Chief Justice, this isn't a trial. It's a reckoning. The people don't want spectacle. They want a court they can believe in. When you cling to secrecy, you betray that belief." The room inhaled as one, her words a blade slicing through his rhetoric. Crockett reached for her final piece of evidence, a single sheet of paper she held with deliberate care. "One last point," she said, her tone measured but unrelenting. "A justice's private meeting with a foreign official, linked to a case before the court, went unreported. No transparency, no accountability. How does this serve the law?" The revelation struck like lightning, the audience erupting in gasps and murmurs. Robert's face paled, his fingers trembling as he gripped his pen. He opened his mouth to respond, but Crockett pressed on, her voice rising with controlled fury. "This isn't one justice, sir. It's a pattern of privilege that mocks the justice you claim to uphold." Robert's composure cracked, his voice rising in a rare flash of anger. "You overstep, Representative. The court's work cannot be reduced to your accusations." But Crockett was unshaken, her response a masterclass in precision. "I'm not reducing it. I'm exposing it. The court's power is immense, but it's not absolute. When justices act above the law, they erode the foundation of our democracy." The room was electric, spectators hanging on her words, some visibly moved. Robert's eyes darted to the audience, sensing the tide turning, his earlier defiance giving way to a flicker of doubt. Crockett's final argument was a crescendo, weaving legal acumen with moral clarity. "The Constitution isn't a shield for the powerful. It's a promise to the people. The court's legitimacy hinges on trust, and trust demands transparency. You can't lead if you won't face the truth." She paused, her gaze locking onto Roberts, her voice softening but no less piercing. "The question isn't why I'm here. It's why you're fighting to keep the shadows." The silence that followed was profound, the weight of her words settling over the room like a verdict. Roberts stared back, his face a storm of conflict, unable to muster a reply. As the gavel struck to close the hearing, the room erupted, not in chaos, but in awe. Spectators rose, some clapping, others wiping tears, moved by Crockett's unflinching stand. Reporters scrambled, their stories already framing her as a legal titan who'd humbled a giant. Roberts gathered his papers, his movements slow, his expression a mix of resignation and introspection. For the first time, he looked not like a chief justice, but a man confronted by his own limits. Crockett stood, her posture calm but triumphant, her eyes scanning the room as if to acknowledge the people her fight was for. The hearing ended, but its impact rippled outward. News outlets blazed with headlines. Crockett's stand shakes. Supreme Court. Social media buzzed with clips of her searing questions, sparking a national conversation about judicial reform. In the days that followed, lawmakers proposed new ethics bills, citing Crockett's arguments, while public pressure mounted for change. Roberts, in a rare statement, acknowledged the need for greater clarity in the court's practices, a concession that felt like a direct echo of Crockett's challenge. She had not just won a hearing, she had ignited a movement, proving that one voice, armed with truth, could shift the course of justice.